Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really happy to have with me once again James Perloff. James joins me the first Tuesday of every month to talk about his book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. We try to cover 2 chapters with each visit, and so we will be spending most of the rest of this year, that is the first Tuesday of each month, throughout the rest of this year to cover this excellent book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. I have found James' work to be trustworthy and exceptionally well documented, and the work that he has carried out over the years, I think, has provided warnings of what is now taking place, both economically and socially in the country. The destruction of freedom and liberties that we have come to enjoy certainly are being, in my view, threatened always more and more, it seems. This show continues to seek the truth about issues that the status quo does not. The status quo actually does its very best to hide from the view of most people. And while many of the views expressed by James and other guests on this show are considered out of fashion and in some cases conspiratorial nonsense, what I try to do is seek the truth, even if that may cost me some listeners here and there. Well, this month in my interview with James, we want to talk about Chapter 7 in his book titled The Media and the Nature of Truth and Lies, and Chapter 8, which is titled The Destruction of Nations. Before we begin our discussion today, for the benefit of listeners who scoff at the notion of conspiracies, let me read you a direct quote from David Rockefeller on page 405 of his autobiography titled David Rockefeller Memoirs. Quote, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States and am conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it." End of quote, David Rockefeller. Well, James, welcome and thank you for joining me again.
Thank you, Jay, for having me back on a great show.
David Rockefeller, who is the oldest member and patriarch of the richest family in America, was, of course, instrumental in growing the Council on Foreign Relations into a massively influential institution that has really shaped the landscape to a great extent of the American political system. But could you give our listeners a sense of how dominant the CFR has been, getting its members into key government positions and into shaping the views of the American people? They certainly have a lot of highly paid PhD scholars from the prestigious universities in the United States and elsewhere. But give our listeners some sense of how dominant the CFR has been.
Well, since it was founded in 1921, the numbers really tell the story. They've had 23 secretaries of war or defense that have come out of the council, and 20 Treasury secretaries, 19 secretaries of state, and 16 CIA directors. And actually, if you look just today at the Obama administration, John Kerry at State, Jacob Lew at Treasury, Chuck Hagel, and then Ashton Carter at Defense, Johnston at Homeland Security, Secretaries of Commerce and Energy, all CFR. And in fact, this year Obama's made 4 Federal Reserve appointments, Janet Yellen, of course, and Stanley Fischer as Vice Chairman, and Lael Brainerd and Jerome Powell to governor positions, and they're all members of the CFR. We're talking about a group that has less than 5,000 members. But in terms of shaping policy over the past century, we could point to the Bretton Woods Conference, which they planned at their Economic and Finance Group before Bretton Woods took place. They planned the UN through what they called their Informal Agenda Group, and of course 47 members of the founding conference were CFR members, 1945. They planned the Marshall Plan study group with a young David Rockefeller as secretary. It was not thought up by General George Marshall. They were the advisors who surrounded Lyndon Baines Johnson during the Vietnam War, and they're the guys who dreamed up the North American Union, people like Robert Pastor, the CFR. These foreign policy entities like NAFTA and the Marshall Plan, these don't come from the American people. They're not the ones who demand them, and they don't actually come from our elected representatives, although they may ultimately vote on them in Congress, but they're dreamed up by the council, and it is the chief architect of our foreign policy, and they're able to do that largely because they do dominate the cabinets of presidents, whether the man in the White House is a Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, and they probably will have something to say about who that man in the White House is, so that they will be sure to have him not too far afield from their desires. But I would happen to think that probably the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Obama just signed into law and we're not allowed to know about for 4 or 5 years, that probably was something they were working hard to push forward as well, wouldn't you think?
Well, they're totally interconnected with the multinational corporations that are planning the TPP, so there would be no question about that.
Now, this brings me to Chapter 7 of your book, which is the first of two chapters we want to focus on today. That's titled The Media and the Nature of Truth and Lies. You start off the chapter with a quote that I found very surprising from Thomas Jefferson. Would you care to comment on what that great founder of our country said about the media, which is in those days was really confined to the printed press?
Well, here's the exact quote. This is from a letter that Jefferson wrote to John Norvell of 1807. He said, quote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The real extent of this state of misinformation is known only to those who are in situations to confront facts within their knowledge with the lies of the day. I really look with commiseration over the great body of my fellow citizens who, reading newspapers, live and die in the belief that they have known something of what has been passing in the world." And he added this, Jefferson said, "I will add that the man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors," unquote, Thomas Jefferson. And, of course, since that time, we've had other media forms naturally arising, the radio and then television, but the principles that Jefferson spoke of still apply very much today.
You know, I mean, you would think if you had the printed press, at least you'd have time to reflect on it. Right now, with the media that we have now, it seems to be just really quick sound bites and sort of instant gratification and stimulation and then on to the next topic without any reflection on it. So if anything, it would seem to me, whereas I get what Jefferson is saying, I think, but I also wonder, you know, if we're not worse off in a sense because it's just all stimulus now, it seems.
Well, I think you're right. When you're reading something, and this has been noted before of literature, that you do have time to process and think about it, but when it's with television, it's just reaction, and who knows, but there may even be some subliminal message that's is being snuck into the television images.
Yeah, in this Chapter 7, you talk about the Rothschilds family. It's one of the richest families in Europe, if not the richest in the world, and one of the richest, certainly, in the world. And you talk about how they managed to gain control of the New York Times, even after they failed to influence President Lincoln during the Civil War. Can you explain how the Rothschild family managed to gain control over the New York Times and why that has become so important?
Well, it's called indirect control, and I picked on the Times just because it is such a symbol of the establishment press. But back in the 19th century, the chief Rothschild financial agent in America was named August Belmont, and his real name was Schenberg. But he, along with the J.P. Morgan interest, financed Adolph Ochs, who, with the big money behind him, then purchased the New York Times. And interestingly enough, back then, it only had a circulation of 9,000. It was really a very small newspaper, but it's amazing what the power of money will do. With that money, he moved it to its new location, which is now called Times Square, named in the Times' honor, and he was able to buy channels of distribution and get pay for the best editors and writers. But that is the power of money. It is not necessarily the power of journalistic integrity. And of course, the ownership passed from him to his son-in-law, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, and then to Orville Dreyfus, and then to Arthur Ochs Sulzberger, and they're all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Times has consistently supported the CFR's views, the globalist views, over the years. That's easily demonstrated, and I give some examples in the book, and also you can easily show that many of the editors and reporters for the Times have been members of the CFR. And, Leslie Gelbs, who's a New York Times editor, did the Pentagon Papers, which was supposed to be exposing what happened in the Vietnam War and demoralize the public to a large extent. But is he going to do an expose of the CFR? Well, obviously not, because he was its president for many years and still is its president emeritus. So there's this definite connection. They're part of the same hierarchy, the foreign policy establishment and the media establishment.
You know, what connection, if any, we've mentioned the Rockefellers, now the Rothschilds. What connection, if any, are there between those two families?
Well, the Rothschilds' interest in America go way back. It's my understanding that they were the chief power behind the original Bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson fought so bitterly. But if you go up to 1910, the Jekyll Island meeting, which is the meeting where the world's leading banking houses got together to form the Federal Reserve. You had the houses of Rothschild, Rockefeller, and Morgan, and representing the Rockefellers, of course, was Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, and Nelson Aldrich, who's the maternal grandfather of David Rockefeller. Along with the man who ran the meeting was Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschilds. He was a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was the Rothschilds banking satellite in New York City. So that's 1910, but move it at 100 years. I'm going to give you a quote, and this is from Forbes magazine, 2012. Quote, the Financial Times reports that RIT Capital Partners, part of the Rothschild banking dynasty, has bought a stake in Rockefeller Financial Services. RIT is acquiring a 37% interest. Former Chase Manhattan Bank chairman David Rockefeller has a long-time personal relationship with the Rothschilds. In a press release, Rockefeller said, Lord Rothschild and I have known each other for 5 decades. The connection between our two families remains very strong. I'm delighted to welcome Jacob and RIT as shareholders and partners in the ongoing development of our investment management and wealth advisory businesses. Unquote. So there you have more than 100 years of relationship.
Yeah. Two of the most powerful families, at least in the Western world, combining there together and forming the Council of Foreign Relations, which has been so influential, and with the money could buy all the intelligent, well, not all of the intelligence, but, the best, the high-priced PhDs from Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, what have you. And, as a young person, I remember thinking, how can I question those guys? I mean, they're a heck of a lot smarter than my parents, and so I went, sort of the inclination was to go with those smart guys. But in any event, in Chapter 7, you talk about the interconnection between virtually all members of the mainstream media. I'm wondering how that could happen. I mean, most people, when they hear that sort of thing, they say, that's just another conspiratorial nut job. I mean, it cannot be, because people are independent, they're free. They're not going to be locked into to one family or two families, or to a small group. But tell us how did that happen? How did the media become essentially not what it appears to be, a free media? We have MSNBC sort of on the left within the political spectrum, and you have Fox on the right. But so on one hand, they seem to be different, and they give the appearance of being quite different. But then when it comes to changing things, they certainly don't make any differences. So, but how did the media become so unified, interconnected?
Well, the answer to that short answer is money. Giving you this quote, I'm sure on the show before, but Ferdinand Lundberg, who wrote for the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications, wrote a book in 1937 about the powers that be. It was called America's 60 Families. And as we said in that book, he said, quote, the United States is owned and dominated by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy which dominates America, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government is actually the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy, unquote. Now, that was written about 80 years ago, but in that book, in Lundberg's book, Chapter 7 was called The Press of the Plutocracy, and Lundberg, he was just using financial records. He went from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he documented that virtually every major newspaper and newspaper chain was owned by these 60 families, either directly or through some agents that were working for them. Quite impressive. But if you go beyond the age of newspapers, to the broadcast age, you find that William Paley was backed by Brown Brothers Harriman. He was the founder of CBS, and Robert Sarnoff, the founder of NBC, was backed by Kuhn Loeb, and Henry Luce of Time Magazine was backed by J.P. Morgan. So it's a matter of money, and it's still consolidated. You have very few corporations running the media today. In fact, you have more than 90% of mainstream media run by just 6 corporations, which are Time Warner, Walt Disney, Viacom, News Corp, CBS, and NBC Universal. And just to give an example of that, Time Warner owns Time Magazine, of course, and CNN, and Turner Broadcasting, and Cinemax, and TBS, and TNT, and Sports Illustrated, and Fortune, and Money and People. And you can do the same with any of those other corporations, but it's money doing the talking, and the power of money has resulted in the consolidation of the media.
So consolidation of power in the hands of fewer and fewer people seems to be the direction that we've been going all along, even as international sovereignty, or the sovereignty of nations, has been declining, with more and more power at the head of fewer and fewer people, it seems to be. In 1991, David Rockefeller praised leading publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post for keeping their mouths shut with respect to secret meetings of the Bilderberg Group, and that, as I understand it, is a subsidiary organization of the Council of Foreign Relations. Well, Rockefeller said that the Bilderberg secret meetings were a key to peace and prosperity. Of course, we are seeing anything but peace and prosperity spreading around the globe right now. I mean, we have, of course, looking at the problems in Europe. China seems to be doing okay in some regards, but that looks like it could be a house of cards to fall anytime, given the lack of free market initiatives. But in the United States, I believe we're in a recession now. We're heading back towards one, probably. But my question to you, James, is how can it be that despite the poor track record of economic and political policies espoused by the CFR, and the public continues to worship these PhDs from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and they don't seem to question. I mean, you would think after a while people would start to say, wait a minute, this isn't working very well. But why do you think people aren't questioning it?
Well, I don't think it's so much that the public worships them as it's sort of self-worship by the TV commentators themselves. But of course, we know that the big media organs like CNN are losing viewers, and more people are following alternative media. But their success has been through this monolithic ownership that we've been talking about, and there's an old maxim to repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth, right? We call that the big lie phenomenon. What happens when you own multiple media outlets, people hear the same thing over and over again, so they eventually develop the impression that there must be a consensus and this must be the truth, when in fact it's simply something that's being repeated through media organs that have the same owners.
Right, a little bit like Jefferson's warnings about the print. You're better off not to read at all, and you'll have a better handle on the truth if you turn the boob tube off, as they say. Another quote from Thomas Jefferson appears on page 86 of your book. Would you care to read what Jefferson had to say, perhaps comment on it with regarding allegations that those who believe the CFR is a conspiratorial organization seeking to overthrow the U.S. are simply helpless paranoids?
Jefferson said this. He said, quote, "Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers too plainly prove a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery," unquote. I mean, that quote could really apply to today. But as far as paranoia goes, it's just a matter of putting things together. It's obvious when you see these plans being played out. For example, we know that at Jekyll Island that Paul Warburg ran that meeting. We know that Benjamin Strong of the J.P. Morgan interest was there. And then what do we see? Lo and behold, without the public or the Congress even knowing about that meeting, we see Woodrow Wilson appointing Paul Warburg to be the first vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and we see Benjamin Strong appointed to run the New York Fed, the very first head of the New York Fed. So the very guys who planned the bank now run the bank. Now, it's not paranoia to simply connect the dots and say this happened by design and not by accident. And all we're doing is applying the same principles that a police detective or a district attorney would do in establishing that a crime has been committed. It's not paranoia. It's critical, rational thinking.
Well, critical, rational thinking, which is something that I would argue our universities don't do a very good job of encouraging. Mm-hmm. More likely what we're encouraged to do is not think for ourselves, but groupthink, in essence. I mean, I can just think back to the days when I was in the university and taking classes. It was just a matter of regurgitating what the good professor told me and told the group, and if you could replay it, you got your A. If you didn't get it quite right, you got a C or something worse. But anyway, going to Chapter 8, the destruction of nations, playing the devil's advocate here, James, let me just try to do that. You and I are on the same page with most of this stuff, so it's not the easiest thing for me to do, but what if I told you I think moving towards a one-world government is a good thing? And the destruction of nationalism is good. It would keep people from, nations from having wars. What worldview do you hold that argues against the notion that a one-world government will be more efficient and more orderly than a world of various nations who have different religions, different cultures, different beliefs? Wouldn't it be better if we could all just get along and think alike?
Well, it'd be great if we did, but the reason you don't want a one world government is man's propensity for evil, and you don't want that power being concentrated in one place. And it was Lord Acton who said that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the Founding Fathers understood that. So even here within America, they made sure that we didn't have all power just vested in the president, but his power would be checked by the Congress. And even within the Congress, you had a check and a balance between the House and the Senate. And as another check, you had the federal courts, the Supreme Court, which could act as a check on them. And on top of those three, you had the states, which by the 10th Amendment, which we're now largely ignoring, had the power to check the federal government. So checks and balances are important. In world government, if you put all authority in one regime, there is no check and balance. And, in the old days of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, you could escape over the Berlin Wall to freedom on the West, right? But what if you had a condition where there was one government and the communists were on both sides? There's nowhere to escape. We do need differing nations to put a check and balance on each other. And if we want to get a little bit biblical, we know that God himself separated the nations at the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis to keep man from becoming too evil. So there's a lot to be said for keeping the nations separate, for having their own sovereignties, their own ethnicities and cultures.
Yeah, well, certainly that was the idea of our founding fathers in the United States, too, to have states' rights, so that if you were unhappy in one state, you could move to another one that suited you better. Of course, that is moving, states are losing their rights all the time, too, as we're seeing unfolding before our eyes. And then internationally, of course, the idea of stripping nations of their sovereignty. Let's talk about the means of this Council of Foreign Relations and this elite group that's trying to do this and set up a one-world government. I'd like you to comment on the following trends of the past, if you would, because I think that sets up sort of the story as how things are unfolding. Talk about colonialism, if you would, and then immigration is another topic in your book, and then new forms of government that are being planned or being now evolving at this time. But start with colonialism, perhaps, or go through those three topics and help us understand how things are unfolding.
Well, I'll do this, of course, much more concisely than in the book, but there is an overarching plan to form a world government, and I have no hesitation in saying that the EU, which came out of the common market, and the proposed North American Union that is supposed to come out of NAFTA are all part of this plan, regional stepping stones. As the big new Brzezinski said, that we can't have world government in one step. He said the key to globalization is progressive regionalization. He said that in 1995. But there are many steps to this, and the destruction of nations or national sovereignty has been integral to that plan of world government. You must get rid of national sovereignty, and that's why the Council of Foreign Relations has always opposed it since its inception. In fact, the Council was founded as a direct reaction to the U.S. Senate's rejection of our joining the League of Nations, which is the first attempt at world government. But in terms of colonialism, they have consistently attempted to separate, and successfully actually separate, the European nations from their colonies. Why do they do that? To disempower them, so that nations like England and Spain, which oversaw vast empires and were very powerful, the sovereign nations, could be reduced to basically nothing more or little more than provinces of the EU, and their former colonies would become members of the UN, where they would have dictators who would accept orders from the international bankers in exchange for IMF loans. In terms of immigration, a lot of awake people are alert to the fact that immigration is troubling our nation, but they understand that the principle of divide and conquer. And my wife is an immigrant. I'm not against immigration, and I think there's definitely a need for immigration within a nation. However, this massive immigrations that they have been in favor of, the purpose is to divide a country by making it lose its ethnicity. I'll just take an example. You take France. At one time, France consisted mostly just of Frenchmen, and there were a common bond of heritage and flag and language, right? But then you have these millions of African immigrants coming in, and all of a sudden you have people there who don't identify with French culture or feel no allegiance to the flag, no allegiance to the country's history, and maybe even don't speak the French language. And once you have a country divided, it's very politically correct, multiculturalism, but it's inherently divisive. And once you divide a country, it's easier for it to lose its feeling of national self-identity and easier to absorb into a regional body like the EU. And as far as forms of government went, I talk in the book a little about monarchies maybe being a little less evil than we've been led to believe. And one of the reasons why we have seen so many monarchies toppled by this whole international banker oligarchy is that they know that to control a nation, they can't get into the bloodline of a monarch. So they're very happy to see a revolution overthrow a monarch and replace it with democracy. And one thing I want to say about democracy, for all the good feelings we have about it, is that democracy is inherently divisive. It divides a country, obviously, into different parties and factions, whereas it used to be that people would rally around their monarch. He was someone who was loyal to or was supposed to be loyal to the entire country. And so that's another feature that they wanted to get rid of the political landscape, was the monarchies, and replace them with democracies, which they would control because they knew that with the power of wealth and control of the media, all they need to control a country is 51% of the vote. When you've got control of the media, it's pretty easy to get that 51%.
Yeah, I've heard it said that democracy is actually mobocracy, so the 51% then can do whatever it wants to the 49%. And the protection of the minorities are simply not there, and we're seeing, I think, more and more of that unfold in the United States as time goes on. One of the topics that I picked up on from Chapter 8 is the ongoing policy of destabilization and chaos. And, it's becoming increasingly chaotic, in my view. The global economy is. Certainly the Middle East is becoming increasingly chaotic. And so the movement to destabilize governments around the world by clandestinely overthrowing leaders, I think we just saw that in the Ukraine. We've seen the United States do that many times. Many times there are even elected governments that don't necessarily agree with us, and we send in our NGOs or a CIA or whatever to destabilize. And folks like George Soros have been well known to sponsor some NGOs that are involved constantly in this effort. I talk to Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He talks to me almost every week about things that are going on like that. But you point out that this movement really took place starting at the end of World War I. Could you quickly talk about, just expand on that if you would, and perhaps relate how the CFR was involved in triggering the war in Vietnam?
Well, actually, we could even go back in terms of revolutions to the French Revolution, which was certainly a financed event and carried out through secret societies. But as far as World War I, that was the war that created the climate for the Bolshevik Revolution. And actually, there's a relevant quote I'd like to give. It's a short one from Nicholas Murray Butler of the Fabian Society in England. He said this in 1937. He said, quote, "Communism is the instrument with which the financial world can topple national governments and then erect a world government with a world police and a world money," unquote.
Wow.
That summarizes a lot of the plan there. But we think of the Rockefellers and Karl Marx as these deadly enemies. But if you look at it, over the years, there's no question that there's been collusion between the Marxist revolutionaries and the banksters. And speaking of World War I, 1917, you had Kuhn Loeb's Jacob Schiff sending Leon Trotsky with $20 million in gold to Russia, and of course his partner at Kuhn Loeb was Paul Warburg, whose brother Max Warburg arranged for Lenin to be sent into Russia with millions of dollars in gold and a train, famously. And Kuhn Loeb even sent up a $50 million fund for Lenin and Trotsky in the Bank of Sweden. And this is all well documented, and some books that I would recommend on this would include Under the Sign of the Scorpion by Jerry Lena. He uses a lot of documents that came to light after Glasnost had opened things up. But some books I'm sure you're familiar with would be Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton, and Red Carpet by Joseph Finder. And they document that even during the Cold War, the West was financing the East with technology and loans.
Yeah. So it seems to me, James, the end game is really a one-world government. I think that's what we've been talking about here. And it seems to me that we're moving very rapidly in that direction. I would argue the TPP recently, you talked about Europe being united and North America, the NAFTA agreement. It seems to me the TPP is aimed at pulling together an Asian government of sorts, although the TPP includes nations around the world. But I think it's also meant to try to control the growth of China right now. But in any event, the end game seems to be a one world government, and now it seems that even Pope Francis seems to be cooperating with his encyclical on global warming and other issues. Do you see rising tensions between the West and NATO on the one hand, and the BRICS on the other as a grand showdown over who gets to be the ultimate dictator of the world?
That's a great question, and there's controversy about that. Now, I guess one way to look at it would be that it's sort of a dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, maybe the thesis being the Western banksters and the antithesis being the BRICS nation and the synthesis being the one world banking system. But, some people think that it's just a charade, the BRICS opposition, and that because people are so suspicious of the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Fed and the IMF, that they want the BRICS to come forward, postulating that the BRICS nations really answer ultimately to the same powers that be, and that the people of the world would be much more accepting of a one world currency if it came from someone like the BRICS, who appear to be genuine alternatives to the financial powers that have done so much destruction. But I don't know what your own sources are telling you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's those are some things that are pretty hard to know, and perhaps even the players in seemingly the opposition BRICS don't really know. I mean, I suppose it's something that's playing out over time, and it's impossible to predict. But knowing what human beings are, James, it seems to me that the selfish nature of human beings would probably have all of these guys who are in agreement with the notion of a one-world government trying to vie for power to become the ultimate leaders within this one-world government, I suppose. But, really, I guess the most important question of all for our listeners, James, as we're seeing the increased carnage, increased chaos that's resulting from dictatorial monetary policy, the Keynesians, the communist, essentially I think Keynes is communist light, or even almost, it puts a good spin and makes it look like a respectable communist dictatorial policy, but we're seeing increasing economic chaos. We're seeing increasing international chaos, and certainly in the Middle East. Or, on one hand, sometimes we're fighting against ISIS, and the next, maybe at the same time in some other part of the Middle East, we're supporting ISIS. ISIS gets our weapons; they turn against us. I mean, it's just a mess. It's just so chaotic. So the big question, I think, the most important question for all of us is, how do we prepare ourselves materially and spiritually to face what I think is going to be a very bad situation ahead of us?
Well, I haven't sounded this kind of alarm before this year, but I do have an article on my website, jamesperloff.com, on Jade Helm, and I do believe there's a genuine threat that we may see the United States transitioning towards martial law. We see it with these massive convoys of equipment. We see it with these lockdowns, with this increasing ISIS threat, which many believe that these ISIS events, the Charlie Hebdo type events, are actually being staged in order to bring about a militarization of the police. And I think that one piece of advice then that I would, or one solid piece of counsel, is that people should be prepared for the possibility of the electrical grid being down, which would mean no access to ATMs, the possibility of the need to have reserve currency, alternative forms of currency, and also the possibility of food shortages, fuel shortages, just being ready as you would be for a hurricane or other geo event. I think people more than ever should be prepared. I'm speaking of the material plane,
sure.
Being prepared for shortages of electricity and food and those types of things. But on the spiritual dimension, people should also be asking more important questions than where the Dow Jones is headed. I think it's time for us to be asking those questions like, what is the meaning of life, and why am I here, and what happens to me when I die, and is there a God, and who is God? And the Bible says that of God, it says, you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. And I think that Jesus said, build your treasure in heaven. And I think these are the kinds of wisdoms that we need to be looking to when we reach this type of potentially lethal collapse types of scenarios that appear very realistic in the future, perhaps the near future.
Yeah, well, indeed, certainly when times get difficult is when we start be more inclined to ask those kind of questions. I guess, if we realize that, as the psalmist says, we live to be 70, or if we're really strong, 80 years, and then we go to the home of our ancestors, and we might want to know, if we go to the home of our ancestors for eternity, we might want to know something about where that is and what it's all about. So anyway, James, thank you very much for giving us the overview of chapters 7 and 8. We'll look to catch the next couple of chapters in a month from now. So thank you very much for being with us today.